What a wonderful turnout tonight. We're so thrilled to welcome so many of you here tonight for the Walter McDougall Fan Club, I think, and for this most important program. My name is Gwen Borowski. I'm the CEO of the museum and also a board member of FPRI. We are so delighted with our partnership with FPRI in this terrific lecture series. We've now done it for a number of years, and we look forward to many, many more to continue really bringing the best in all aspects of foreign policy, geopolitical issues here at the museum. Someone tonight asked how long we've been in this building, and the answer is 1995. So we opened in 2000. For those of you who are new to us, we hope you'll come back and look around and see our exhibits. And particularly today, in a climate of very polarized climate, our role as a haven for good, safe discourse from all sides of the fence, and a good exchange of ideas, and to nurture the next generation of active citizens is certainly more crucial than ever, and it's why we exist. We certainly do that in our building and our exhibits, and as you come back next year, you'll notice some things being taken apart as we rebuild several galleries in our museum, so stay tuned for that. We have a lot of exciting things planned. And we do it with our education programs. We were founded as an education center, unlike many museums that start with a collection. We started with education and then worked our way to a building. So somewhat unusual, and we have a very active program going out into the Philadelphia schools and bringing thousands of kids here to learn about civics as it relates to being a person of good character. Those two things go together. I think everybody in this room knows that. And a myriad amount of programs also around those different themes. Many more exciting things planned for this coming year. You'll see information at our front desk. And please sign our mailing list if you'd like to be included to see what's coming up. We'd love to reach out to you. So again, welcome. And now Alan will come up and introduce our speaker.
It's nice to be back at the National Liberty Museum and to welcome all of you to the last session in our Stanley and Arlene Ginsburg lecture series for this fall. So thanks to Stan and Arlene Ginsburg. I know Walter has a lot to say tonight, so I'm going to forgo my usual spiel about FPRI. If you want to ask questions later, I'm around. But it is a great honor to present to you my colleague, Walter McDougall. He's been with FPRI and with Penn probably for about 30 years or close, and he's held many hats at FPRI. But let me begin with, after college, he served in Vietnam. He went on to get a Ph.D. at the University of Chicago, studying under the world historian William McNeill, about whom he wrote a great memorial appreciation earlier this year. He went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. He went on to teach at the University of California at Berkeley and won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Heavens and the Earth, A Political History of the Space Age, which was my introduction to Walter McDougall. And very soon after, he came over to Penn, and I looked him up to try to get him involved in FPRI, and I think that's one of my greatest accomplishments at FPRI. He has written a number of books on U.S. history, the history of the Pacific. He's also written a number of essays, all of which, for us, that appear on our website. When I look them over, they're all classics. You can't argue with geography. American exceptionalism exposed, the three reasons we teach history, Religion and Diplomatic History, and the Wisdom of Robert Strauss-Hupé, our founder. I urge you to go back to our website and look over all of those essays on a wide range of topics. You will be richly rewarded. I consider Walter and my other colleague, Jim Kurth, who's here in the back, kind of the heart and soul of FPRI. So we're here to ask him to talk about his new book just out, The Tragedy of U.S. Foreign Policy, How America's Civil Religion Betrayed the National Interest. It's for sale at the back, along with our hats, Make America Think Again. And please welcome Walter McDougall.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thanks to Stanley and Arlene Ginsburg for sponsoring this lecture series. Thanks to all of the FPRI trustees and members who are here tonight. Thank you for your generous support. And welcome to the guests that some of them I know have brought with them tonight. Let's say I hope my performance will not disappoint. Not only the guests, but the people who drug them here. Alan just mentioned that he considers Walter and Jim Kurth to be the heart and the soul of the FPRI. And I immediately began to think, which one's the heart and which one's the soul? I think he said it in the right order. That man is the soul, I'm just the emotive heart. Well, thank you. I'm here to talk about my new book, which just came out from Yale. And it occurs to me that readers today, and certainly in the future, you accepted because I'm going to tell you about it, will probably assume, people in the future especially, that the author of this book designed it to be his swan song. The somber reflection of a, let's face it, aging historian on the ascent of his nation to great power, unprecedented power and glory, which was then tragically squandered in hubris and nemesis. A sort of a 21st century reprise of Thucydides. But nothing could be further from the truth. This was not some planned as some swan song. On the contrary, I never intended to write this book at all. Following the publication in 2004 and 2007 of my lengthy histories on the American founding and the American Civil War era, freedom just around the corner and then throes of democracy, I expected to complete the trilogy. It was planned as a trilogy, with a volume on the progressive era, during which the U.S. matured as a world power. Instead, HarperCollins terminated the project on the grounds that my books were critical successes, which meant they got good reviews but didn't sell. And frankly, I acquiesced because, well, those two big tomes totaling over 1,300 pages had worn me out. So I decided to lie fallow for a few years and then perhaps write a sequel or revised edition of an earlier work, Promised Land Crusader State, The American Encounter with the World Since 1776. Not that it needed correction. On the contrary, that book proved prophetic, even marked by Cassandra's curse. For in it, I had urged Americans to return, after the Cold War, to the foreign policy principles of our once modest republic, lest the United States' 50 years of mobilization as a crusader state destroy forever its original identity as a promised land. For instance, I wrote, in 1997, mind you, everyone agrees Saddam Hussein is bad for his country. But can Americans be better Iraqis than Iraqis themselves? Or presume to tell the Chinese how to be better Chinese? If we try, we can only be poorer Americans, unquote. No wonder I felt compelled to revisit the themes in Promised Land Crusader State following the terrorist attacks of 9/11, 2001, and especially the catastrophic U.S. reaction to them. But the publishers of Promised Land Crusader State, Houghton Mifflin, also showed no interest in a follow-on to a book that hadn't been a bestseller to begin with. And that left me in a quandary, because I'd already arranged for a sabbatical in 2012 and procured an outside grant to help fund it. I had to write something. But what? So even as I spent that year frantically catching up on 15 years of new scholarship on the history of U.S. foreign relations, I remained clueless about where the research might lead, if anywhere. At length, my friend and mentor in old age, my personal owl of Minerva, came to the rescue. I had gotten into the pleasant and profitable habit of lunching once or twice a month with James Kurth, whose brilliance and wisdom are well known to this FPRI audience. But you may not also know he's a shrewd psychologist. Kurth listened patiently for several months while I agonized over my dilemma before choosing just the right moment to make a suggestion. Write what you know and care about. Write what truly expresses Walter McDougall. You mean, I haltingly answered, American civil religion? Exactly, said he. Now, Kurth had heard me speculate at various times about this idea, about reinterpreting U.S. foreign policy through the lens of civil religion. I like to call it American diplomatic history in the metaphysical mode. Kurth also knew I'd begun offering a seminar at Penn titled In Search of the American Civil Religion. And the timing of his suggestion was perfect. Yes, that was the mystery I needed to solve. Indeed, such a book would not only be important and timely, but also, I foolishly thought, fun and easy to write. Moreover, the topic would give me the chance to settle some scores by debunking an awful book called Dangerous Nation, written by Robert Kagan after George W. Bush's re-election. That book was an extreme example of the fallacy known as prolepsis, essentially reading history backwards, assuming your conclusion. Because Kagan claimed U.S. foreign policy had always pointed to a messianic calling to redeem the whole world. Hence, the Bush Doctrine and the Freedom Agenda in the Middle East were as American as apple pie. Kagan even had the temerity to publish an article declaring George Washington was a neocon, exclamation point. Talk about prolepsis. The transparent purpose of Kagan and his colleague, his comrade, Bill Kristol, was to purge the Republican Party of what they called the crabbed conservatism of realists like George Kennan and, implicitly, the author of Promised Land Crusader State. So it was, for reasons born of professionalism, personal interest, and pique, I set out to deconstruct our evolving civil religion and to trace its influence on foreign policy. What I discovered, as weeks turned to months, turned to years, was this is a very difficult book to get right. Suffice to say, it took 5 anxious years. But here, at last, is the result. My original title, which I fancied was suitably edgy, was called American Heresies, Civil Religion and Foreign Affairs since 1776. But the marketing mavens at Yale rejected heresies and even balked at civil religion because they said, readers won't know what the words even mean. Well, the result was a war of attrition, after which we finally settled on the current title, The Tragedy of U.S. Diplomacy, How American Civil Religion Betrayed the National Interest. Now, what's it about? Jean-Jacques Rousseau introduced the concept of civil religion in the 8th chapter of the 4th book of his The Social Contract of 1762. Rousseau meant to describe the faith that could bind citizens of a republic together, citizens who have thrown off their age-old thraldom to throne and altar. In other words, he's anticipating the French Revolution. But in reality, the truth is, throne and altar, religion and political authority have always, almost always, been two sides of the same coin. Because nearly every political regime throughout history in all civilizations has claimed some sort of spiritual legitimacy as well as secular authority. From the god kings of ancient empires to the mandate of heaven of East Asian dynasties to the sultans of Islam or the patron saints of Renaissance city-states, the divine right of kings in Catholic Europe and the state-controlled Protestant churches of early modern Europe. The most obvious example was post-Reformation England. What is the Anglican Church if not a civil religion? And of course, the American civil religion is a Republican variant of the British one. Now here's as neat and neutral a definition as I have ever found. It's by sociologist Ellis West. Quote, "A civil religion is a set of beliefs and attitudes that explain the meaning and purpose of any given political society in terms of its relationship to a transcendent spiritual reality that are held by the people generally in that society and that are expressed in public rituals, myths, and symbols," unquote. That transcendent spiritual reality is what distinguishes civil religion from, for instance, idolatrous ideologies such as fascism and communism. Americans did not worship their government because they recognized, as James Madison wrote, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But since it is axiomatic, or was, that human beings are flawed creatures, the framers of the Constitution carefully checked and balanced the powers of their government. What Americans really worshiped was a deity whose theology was a rich amalgam of Protestantism and Enlightenment reason. The deity who made them one out of many, e pluribus unum, a new order for the ages, novus ordo seclorum, and who blessed their undertakings, annuit coeptis, to quote the phrases inscribed on the Great Seal of the United States. Over 200 years, Americans took all that for granted, so much so that even as they embraced and practiced their divine right republicanism, as I like to call it, Americans never acknowledged their civil faith until 1967, when Berkeley sociologist Robert Bellah published his seminal article on American civil religion in the journal Daedalus. Over the 20-odd years that followed, a rash of books and articles appeared that dug up the rhetoric and assessed the influence of this phenomenon, American civil religion. My own consciousness, however, did not stem from that 20-year period. I sort of missed it all. I was studying European history in graduate school, and it was only later, during my research for Promised Land Crusader State, and then especially for Freedom Just Around the Corner, A New American History, 1585 to 1829, that I came to see, yes, that's right, the War of Independence really was a holy war for Americans because the colonial patriots risked their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor in the belief they were actors in a play scripted by the author of history. Who was that author? I suppose most churched Americans assumed the God who watched out for their country was the same one they worshiped on Sunday morning. But the American God had no name, or 100 vaguely Unitarian names. The presidents from Washington to Andrew Jackson referred to him as Father of Lights, Supreme Architect, Almighty Being, Invisible Hand, Patron of Order, Fountain of Justice, Infinite Power, or just Providence. For a surprising percentage of founders, he was also the Freemasons' G, the God whose name is geometry and whose watchful eye oversees the unfinished pyramid that appears on our Great Seal and, incidentally, on the back of your $1 bills. If Americans had ever fallen to quarreling over the identity of their national God, the Union might not have survived. So the Constitution was silent about religion. Not because the Revolution was secular, but because it was civil religious. So the No Establishment Clause of the First Amendment established what I call the classical ACR, American Civil Religion, whose gospels include the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and Washington's farewell address, and whose apostolic epistles, if you will, included the presidential inaugural addresses and other prominent public speeches. What was the etiology of this ACR? Well, we baby boomers were taught by Perry Miller, Daniel Boorstin, and a host of textbooks that John Winthrop's 1630 sermon to the Puritan founders of New England was really the keynote address of American political culture, with its unique notions of exceptionalism and messianic mission. That, of course, was conventional wisdom during the Cold War, when Americans needed to be persuaded by their elites to make global commitments and sacrifices. Today, however, we know better. Thanks to the rhetorical archaeology of historian Richard Gamble, whose book, In Search of the City on a Hill, The Making and Unmaking of an American Myth, proves that the civil religious trope derived from Winthrop's sermon was in fact a 20th century invention. It was an artifact of America, the Crusader state, not an archetype of America, the Promised Land. But meanwhile, I had begun to trace the ACR to what seemed to be its real source, which, not surprisingly, was the British civil religion painfully crafted over 175 years of Tudor-Stuart history. First, the English tamed their church by placing their monarch at its head. Then they tamed the monarch in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Then they embarked on their stunning career of imperial expansion imbued with four spirits: the spirit of rural and commercial capitalism on a national scale, a spirit of rabid anti-Catholicism, a spirit of aggressive imperial expansion, and a kind of a legal spirit, a judicial spirit, that amounted to a right of eminent domain over all lands currently occupied by indigent people. Push them aside. They're indigent. They're not doing with the land what God wants them to do, such as the Irish. They were the first, and later the Indians of North America. And no one imbibed those four spirits more deeply than the settlers of the 13 American colonies. But following Britain's conquest of New France in the last French and Indian War in 1763, Crown and Parliament tried to adjust to their new imperial responsibilities by enacting new taxes, new restrictions on the colonies, which appeared to the growingly self-conscious Americans to violate all four imperial spirits. The British had become heretics in their own church. So hot-headed patriots, and not just the New England Puritans, but the Quakers of the Delaware Valley, Cavalier planters of the Chesapeake and the Carolinas, and the Scots-Irish bordermen out on the frontier rebelled. Those cradle cultures, lovingly examined by David Hackett Fisher's book Albion's Seed, expressed various definitions of liberty, but all patriots had cause to resist British authority. And after the War of Independence, all four cultures collaborated on a constitution that accommodated in remarkable fashion the Puritan notion of ordered liberty under law, the Quakers' live and let live, freedom of conscience, the Cavaliers' aristocratic notion of hierarchical liberty, and the wild libertarianism of the Scots-Irish. Amazing. In foreign policy, however, the first and greatest high priest of the classical ACR was George Washington. It's sobering to revisit the precepts of his farewell address and recall that Americans once held them sacred. Washington modeled his address, as so many colonial pastors and politicians had done, on Moses, whose farewell address in the book of Deuteronomy promised the Israelites they would thrive in their land of milk and honey if they obeyed the Lord's commandments, but would be cast out and become a byword if they whored after foreign gods. Likewise, Washington admonished Americans jealously to preserve individual liberty and national unity, to cultivate religion and morality, to cherish the public credit. Oh my, have we forgotten that one? To observe good faith and justice, peace and harmony with all nations, to avoid inveterate antipathies or attachments toward foreign countries, and to, while extending commercial relations, to shun political alliances except in emergencies. Washington prophesied that if future generations heeded those precepts, the U.S. would grow and prosper beyond measure. Well, do you know what Robert Kagan had to say about that? He claimed Washington did not mean what he said. He didn't mean it. What he really meant was Americans, if they kept those rules for maybe one generation, by that time the U.S. would be mighty enough to dictate terms to the rest of the world. And that laid the basis for Kagan's further claim to the effect that John Quincy Adams didn't really mean it when he assured the Congress in 1821, America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. The proof text Kagan employed to buttress that idiosyncratic argument was an 1817 letter in which Adams writes, "The universal feeling of Europe in witnessing the gigantic growth of our population and power is that we shall, if united, become a very dangerous member of the Society of Nations," unquote. Well, I parsed the context and the timing of that letter from every angle and concluded Adams meant the opposite of what Kagan claimed. Adams was suggesting that if Americans remained true to Washington's precepts, they would soon provide so great an example of liberty and prosperity that Europeans themselves would get the message and come to question the legitimacy of their own monarchical institutions. But, Adams warned, if Americans allowed sectionalism to tear the Union asunder, they would become dangerous to themselves. Of course, sectional strife continued to build, not least because of the impact of that explicitly civil religious movement dubbed Manifest Destiny by the Jacksonian editor John O'Sullivan. He identified the United States as that church against which the gates of hell shall not prevail. and he assured Americans of their heavenly destiny. Well, in reality, of course, the United States manifested its destiny through hardball war and diplomacy, while the Mexican Cession of 1848 revived the prospect that slavery might just be extended westward, no longer limited by the Missouri Compromise. That touched off or reignited a hot sectional conflict that escalated into secession, civil war, and a schism in the civil religion. The decisive outcome was, of course, the ratification of the institutions, the theology, and the eschatology of the Republican Party, which amounted, therefore, to a kind of revised orthodoxy, which I term the neoclassical ACR. Neo, but still classical, because U.S. foreign policy did not change. Not for another generation. In spite of tremendous changes in America, urbanization, immigration, rapid industrialization. Kagan, however, pretends that Lincoln's rhetoric and war mobilization somehow prepared the United States for its career as the world's liberator. It just isn't so. The voluminous works of Abraham Lincoln, 1820 volumes, contain nothing at all, not a word about foreign policy. Lincoln's own administration, and with the Secretary of State Seward, and indeed American presidents on down to the rest of the 19th century, continued to honor Washington's precepts. And Lincoln's ominous warning, "We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope on earth," that expressed his real concern, which was not the extension of liberty everywhere, but the survival of liberty anywhere. What hope will the rest of the world have if we can't even save liberty here in America? He even closed his second inaugural address with the plaintive plea that Americans will, quote, "do all which may achieve a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations," unquote. Those were Washingtonian words that hardly suggested Lincoln was some crusader searching for monsters to destroy. Why did American foreign policy display such remarkable continuity from the 1790s on down to the 1890s? I believe, although I wouldn't argue it, that the reason was U.S. foreign policy was self-contained by four prudential checks. First, because of the doctrine associated with James Monroe, but really drafted by John Quincy Adams, and already implicit, frankly, in the writings of the founders, that the New World and the Old World must be worlds apart, must remain separate spheres. And if Americans wanted to keep European powers from mucking around in the Western Hemisphere, why, Americans must refrain from mucking around in theirs. That was self-containment number one. Secondly, westward expansion was a check, a prudential check, because no sane American wanted to risk the nation's manifest destiny by picking fights with overseas powers. Third were the lessons learned from the collapse of republics, both ancient and modern. 19th century Americans lived in fear of some Alcibiades, Julius Caesar, Cromwell, or Robespierre in their midst, and they fiercely guarded their Constitution. And fourth was the classical ACR, based on the Christian anthropology that most Americans still believed in, that held human nature, even their own human nature, to be imperfect and incorrigible. As late as 1897, President William McKinley restated this creed. Quote, "Our faith teaches us there is no safer reliance than upon the God of our fathers, who has so singularly favored the American people in every national trial, and who will not forsake us so long as we obey his commandments and walk humbly in his footsteps. It has been the policy of the United States since the foundation of the government to cultivate relations of peace and amity with all the nations of the world, and this accords with my conception of our duty now. We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression. War should never be entered upon until every agency of peace has failed. Peace is preferable to war in almost every contingency." Unquote. What happened? What happened to change McKinley's heart, mind, and soul a year later? What happened was an accident in the form of the Cuban insurrection against Spanish rule. But in retrospect, it was an accident waiting to happen because of the rise of a war party and the spread of a heresy. The war party advocated a modern navy and overseas bases to promote U.S. trade and spheres of influence. Its leaders, such as Henry Cabot Lodge, Theodore Roosevelt, Captain A.T. Mahan, these were prudent nationalists adjusting to a modern world of ubiquitous imperialism and navalism. By contrast, the heretics, whose leaders included secular and religious progressive elites, were zealous crusaders. Progressivism. Historian Bruce Kuklick defined the movement pithily. We should associate progressivism most with the rise of a more relaxed Protestantism in higher education after the Civil War. Period. And the missing link between the secular elites in government, academics, business, the military, and the broad American public was precisely the more relaxed Protestantism known as the social gospel. Now, during the late 19th century, American universities and the new land-grant colleges devoted themselves to secular research on the German model. And the new knowledge generated in science and engineering, modern languages, sociology, political science, economics, persuaded progressives that the keys to the kingdom had passed from the clergy to credentialed experts who could help them, quote, manage God's universe for the benefit of mankind, unquote. After all, great forces were at work in the world. Industrialization, urbanization, mass immigration, corporatism, labor unrest, all manner of social pathologies in American cities. Progressives wanted to modernize government, to reform it, to address the challenges of modern society. And of course, they believed they had the expertise to do so. All they needed was power. Meanwhile, during the late 19th century, same decades, liberal clergy increasingly surrendered to modern science. They abandoned the Bible's history and stories of miracles, and so they reimagined the church to keep it relevant as an agent of social uplift. Indeed, capable of building God's kingdom right here on earth, according to the increasingly scientific laws which they now believed governed the spiritual as well as the physical world. Celebrity pastor. Now, I'm not talking about all American Protestants, or perhaps even most American Protestants. The people in the pews were being led by these progressive leaders. But the elites in the mainstream churches, the mainline churches in America, were on board for this new liberal theology. Celebrity pastor Washington Gladden called it applied Christianity. Celebrity theologian Walter Rauschenbusch stressed collective rather than personal salvation, and he welcomed government's help in promoting welfare at home and throughout the world. Rauschenbusch wrote, quote, "The social gospel registers the fact that for the first time in history, the spirit of Christianity has a chance to form a working partnership with real social and psychological science," unquote. And notoriously, the Reverend Josiah Strong and his followers merged the social gospel with social Darwinism of the white man's burden variety. All these movements melded in 1898 when the War Party realized the way to get Americans to support foreign adventures was to sell them as humanitarian interventions, which in the case of Cuba meant slaying the Spanish Catholic dragon and saving the Cuban damsel in distress. And when the Spanish-American War displaced or dropped down the memory hole the Cuban War of Independence, Rauschenbusch exulted. He preached, quote, "To historians 100 years hence, this year will be one of the great mountain ranges in the geography of times, a great watershed from which the rivers begin to flow toward new and distant oceans. The pillar of fire has lifted and moved. We must break camp and follow," unquote. In sum, the progressive clergy turned the thou shalt nots of the classical ACR into the thou musts of a newly progressive ACR that now claimed God hadn't raised America to great power and wealth just to be an example. That seemed tantamount to hiding one's lamp under a bushel. And most progressives were even eager to annex colonies overseas so long as Americans could civilize their benighted inhabitants. We were to be good imperialists, unlike some of the Europeans. President McKinley converted so thoroughly to progressive ACR that even as the U.S. Army was waging a bloody war against the Philippine independence movement, McKinley declared at his second inaugural, quote, "The American people, entrenched in freedom at home, take their love for it wherever they go. And they reject as mistaken and unworthy the doctrine that we lose our own liberties by securing the foundations of liberty to others. Our institutions will not deteriorate by extension, and our sense of justice will not abate under tropic suns in distant seas," unquote. I believe, I'm not a theologian, but I believe that's how heresy works. Heresy jettisons the whole counsel of God in favor of one or two principles out of which it builds a whole new theology and then concocts a whole new history to justify it, all the while calling the faith by the same name. 4 years later, G.K. Chesterton would observe that in modern heresies, not only vice is let loose, quote, "the virtues are let loose also, and the virtues wander more widely, and the virtues do more terrible damage," unquote. No one illustrated the damage of virtues run wild more than the president who carried progressive ACR to its utopian heights, Woodrow Wilson. In a 1911 address called The Bible and Progress, Wilson lectured, quote, "There are times in the history of nations when they must take up the crude instruments of bloodshed in order to vindicate spiritual conceptions. For liberty is a spiritual conception," I'm sure they would agree here, "and when men take up arms to set other men free, there is something sacred and holy in the warfare. I, 1911 now, this is long before the war, I will not cry peace so long as there is sin and wrong in the world. Unquote. Woodrow Wilson. Even before the outbreak of the war, he was making America a truly dangerous nation. During that war, Wilson preached a pious neutrality, but in fact pursued policies that amounted to giving Britain all aid short of war, 25 years before FDR coined that phrase. But by 1917, when the British signaled they were exhausted and broke, Wilson was caught. Even American economic aid had not allowed the Allies to prevail. The United States would have to get into the war. And so Wilson had somehow to persuade the Congress and people to violate the spirit and the letter of Washington's farewell address. Wilson was up to the task. He was a great orator. He summoned his eloquence, and he preached a wholesale reformation of the ACR that made the United States the world's Messiah, stirred up millenarian frenzy, and told soldiers, his Office of War Information called them Pershing's Crusaders, told them they were fighting to build the kingdom of heaven on earth. Well, you know the end. Wilson's crusade miscarried so badly, due in part to his own colossal misjudgments, that the Senate debate on the League of Nations played out like a heresy trial. But then, that's exactly what it was, a heresy trial of the ACR. So in the end, the progressive ACR failed to establish itself as a new orthodoxy, even though world wars and revolutions rendered impossible a return to the neoclassical ACR. That made the years 1920 to 47 a long cusp, a long period of anomie or belief in nothing or doubt, during which Americans reached no consensus on what mission God intended their holy nation to perform in the 20th century. But wait a minute, 1947, why 47? Didn't FDR lead the country into World War II under a Wilsonian banner? And didn't he style it another holy war between the God-fearing people of the whole earth and the totalitarian pagans? He certainly did. Moreover, he shrewdly foresaw that this time the U.S. would emerge from the war with such military and economic dominance that he, unlike Wilson, would be able to cajole all other nations to submit to an American New World Order. But Roosevelt failed as high priest of the ACR because he never could make the war a crusade. They call it the greatest generation. Whether that's true or not, certainly the generation of the Depression and World War II was the unluckiest generation, since perhaps the Civil War. And Americans in 1941-42 entered that war in a bitter, impatient, and vengeful mood. Nor did they have any love for their presumed allies, the British Empire and the Soviet Union. Finally, Joseph Stalin made it clear by war's end that FDR's blueprint for a U.S.-led New World Order was stillborn. The cusp continued for a couple of years, and what finally inspired a new consensus, a consensus around what I call the neo-progressive ACR, was precisely the Cold War. Because fear of communist subversion and aggression in a now nuclear world created a permanent emergency and caused the presidents and the Congress to dismantle not only the creed, but the constitutional checks and balances of the classical ACR. Henceforth, presidents, not Congresses, declared or initiated military interventions. Let's put it that way, because they ceased to call them wars. If you call it a war, you've got to go to Congress and ask them to do their constitutional duty to declare it. Well, we want to intervene, but we don't want to call it, we don't want to get into a constitutional hassle over, so we just won't declare it a war. We'll call it something else. The Korean police action or the Vietnam conflict, et cetera, et cetera. Henceforth, the nation's manpower and economy remained on a permanent war footing. Henceforth, the executive branch funneled money and guns to all manner of foreign governments, made entangling alliances all over Eurasia, engaged in covert actions, including assassinations, and substituted executive agreements for formal treaties because they didn't have to be subject to Senate ratification. Americans acquiesced in all those de facto repeals because they were persuaded God was calling their nation to lead the free world in an existential struggle against totalitarian atheism. Those were the years when presidents told the people in so many words, look at Truman's and Kennedy's inaugurals especially, or Johnson's over-the-top rhetoric, that America possessed the power, the technology, the wealth, and expertise to end poverty, conquer disease, free all nations, and establish perpetual peace, at least in the free world, if not the communist world. The implication behind that chiliastic agenda, the implication, unspoken assumption was that, well, America has a God-given mission, we all grant that, and it's axiomatic that God doesn't give missions to prophets or whole nations without equipping them with the resources to fulfill them. Those were the years when mainstream churches blessed nuclear deterrence, containment, and limited war. When Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy invoked the Judeo-Christian tradition that amounted in practice to the materialist church Will Herberg dubbed the American way of life. Those were the years when In God We Trust became the national motto and Under God was added to the pledge. When American exceptionalism got coined and popularized. When Eisenhower said, our government has no sense unless it's grounded on religious faith, and I don't care what it is. When Kennedy, the first Catholic president, turned out to be the most zealous exponent of neo-progressive ACR. Cold War presidents promised their national congregations the U.S. was on the side of the angels. The U.S. was destined to prevail in what Kennedy called the long twilight struggle. And when that glorious day arrived, they promised Americans an immanentized eschaton, a veritable heaven on earth, global peace, freedom, prosperity, and the dawning of a millennial ACR that would double as the first global civil religion. You think that's hyperbole? You think McDougall's exaggerating? A vivid vision of that utopia, that small world after all, basking in peace through understanding and the satisfaction of the material needs of the whole human race through scientific and technological progress, that vision was already on display and promoted with suitable Madison Avenue hype in the pavilions and rhetoric of the 1964 New York World's Fair. I love that passage in my book. Buy the book just for that. I also have great stuff on the Seattle Fair and on the earlier New York Fair in 1939. Even the youth rebellions of the turbulent 1960s were a kind of a distinction without a difference. In his book, Telltale Hearts, Adam Garfinkel speculated the counterculture and protest movements amounted to a sort of religious revival. I believe he was right, except it was a civil religious movement by which young people protested the militant Cold War ACR in the name of that millennial ACR their presidents claimed to be pursuing. The youth asked, well, why then? Why poverty, militarism, and racism? Why do they still exist in the United States itself? And when the grown-ups had no answer, the kids threw a tantrum. The 1960s were a decade both technocratic and highly romantic. Think James Bond novels, which Kennedy loved, by the way, the Apollo moon program, the plaintive folk songs, the eschatological expectations of both right and left. It's really no wonder, in retrospect, that was the decade when Robert Bellah noticed and named the phenomenon American civil religion. But no sooner did his article appear in 1967 than race riots, protests, assassinations, the Vietnam War, soon enough Watergate, the OPEC embargo, stagflation, all made it seem ACR was in headlong retreat. Well, the U.S. managed to weather that crisis over the course of the 1970s, but only by going through three painful purgations. First, Richard Nixon purged the nation of its 60s romanticism through domestic policies that combined a tough law and order stance with a liberal social agenda that dwarfed Johnson's Great Society, frankly. But plus, he added foreign policies of retrenchment in pursuit of détente and realpolitik. That was purge number one. Second, the establishment elites, alarmed by Nixon's landslide reelection and indications that he was planning to pull off a presidential coup d'etat of some sort, purged the nation of Nixon through the convenient Watergate scandal. Third, Jimmy Carter's administration purged Americans of their cynicism by remoralizing U.S. foreign policy and then reviving the Cold War. We can see in retrospect that those three great purgations cleared the stage for the advent, I use the term advisedly here in Advent season, of Ronald Reagan. Reagan was Cold War America's greatest high priest, a true believer whose rhetoric sparkled and whose economic and foreign policies were stunningly successful. I believe he deserves much of the credit for bringing the Cold War to a peaceful conclusion. But Reagan wasn't really conservative. He was the living expression of the neo-progressive ACR. Reagan revered Tom Paine and the future, not Edmund Burke and the inherited past. Reagan's mantra was that America is the shining city on a hill, which all nations are destined to emulate. Reagan failed to trim government, failed to balance the budget, failed to promote traditional values, or, frankly, discourage Americans' flight into consumerism and hedonism. Reagan's mystical creed transcended mundane politics altogether in a mix of optimism, common sense, and nostalgia raised to the level of civil theology. Ronald Reagan, God bless him, preached a Walt Disney, Henry Luce, New York World's Fair gospel of a peaceful, prosperous, Americanized world. And contrary to everyone's expectations but his own, it descended to earth right on cue. Or so it seemed at the time. It seemed the collapse of the Soviet Union ushered in just what Cold War ACR had promised, a millennial era during which ACR would double as the first global civil religion, and nations must sooner or later embrace American values and institutions. Francis Fukuyama wrote about the end of history. Michael Mandelbaum called democracy, peace, and free enterprise the ideas that conquered the world. Conquered the world. It's over. Thomas Friedman claimed the world is flat. They all hailed the Clinton administration's Washington Consensus, while neoconservatives imagined an American benevolent hegemony in a so-called new American century, exporting democracy and capitalism everywhere. We know how it all turned out. All of the euphoria ended on a crisp, clear September morning in 2001, and the story has been pretty much all downhill ever since. The millennial ACR has proven to be just as ephemeral as progressive ACR at the beginning of the 20th century, because post-Cold War America, like Wilson's America, got tempted to play God at an enormous cost in lives and treasure, at home and especially abroad. 15 years after 9/11, in 2016, it is now clear Americans are lost in another long cusp, utterly confused about what role God intends the United States to play in the world of the 21st century. It's kind of an anticlimax, but that's where we are. Thank you very much.
As a Canadian High Tory, I tend to see more continuity in American foreign policy than you do, beginning with Benjamin Franklin appearing before the gates of Quebec and trying to liberate the French-Canadian Catholics from the hegemony of the English slave masters, and the French Roman Catholics saying, no thank you very much, and sending them home. Right through to the acquisition of Alaska. And until 1936, Canada actually had a contingency plan if we were to be invaded by the United States. There were, including the Fenian raids, there were 7 minor attacks, beginning with Franklin, et cetera, and through the Civil War. So I think there's a continuity between Reagan's shining city on the hill and that of Winthrop's.
Your history is accurate, insightful, and persuasive. I don't quibble or quarrel with anything that you have just said. In my book, I make it clear that there were always Americans who were split-minded. Thomas Jefferson was very split-minded. He ended up essentially affirming Washington's farewell address and restating it in his own inaugural and practicing a foreign policy that conformed to what I call the classical ACR. But he was very split-minded. Henry Clay was very split-minded. General Grant, after the Civil War, was kind of split-minded. And certainly the American operations, especially against Canada, not only in the Revolution, but in the War of 1812, were aggressive. But we learned our lesson. You licked us.
Thank you.
And so Americans learned their lesson after the War of 1812 and never again risked. There were some crises and quarrels, the worst being, of course, during the Civil War, possibility of British intervention. But Americans never again in the 19th century risked getting into a conflict with a major overseas power. Do you know the book by Maya Jasanoff called, the subtitle is The Spirit of 1783? It's a wonderful story about what happened to the Tories after U.S. independence. And she traces where they went, most of them to Canada, but many to South Africa, or even later on to Australia, and they diffused this Tory British spirit that in many ways was far more liberal than the radical Republican spirit of the American people. That's just a footnote.
Just a quick supplementary, if I may. Did you draw upon Will Herberg's Protestant Catholic Jew at
Yes.
all in the American
Yes.
civil religion?
Yeah.
Okay, Nelson Wolf.
The world has become compressed since George Washington. By that I mean it's smaller. And in his day, the oceans protected us. The oceans no longer protect us. So my question to you is clearly foreign policy must change to reflect that. And in fact, Jefferson, long time ago, proposed an alliance to defeat the Barbary pirates because they were impacting on our foreign trade. So how do you adjust this foreign policy with this compressed world?
Well, the Jefferson example, the Barbary pirates, is often invoked, and it's such a minor example. That was a Virginian's pride, the pride of a Virginian planter who was over there in Paris and was the U.S. minister to France during the time of these various predations by the Barbary pirates. And the idea that the American flag, not to mention commerce and lives, were being threatened by these brigands drove him nuts. And by God, when he became president, he took action against the Barbary pirates. But then, having done so, he mothballed the Navy. He mothballed the United States Navy in the middle of a world which by then was at war. The Napoleonic Wars were raging, and he demobilized the Navy. He cut the defense budget back to nothing. But anyway, the point is, your overall point obviously is correct. The United States used to be far more secure than it has been in the 20th century. But let's not exaggerate the security of our two great ocean moats. Because in the early years of the Republic, the oceans were bristling with the navies of the imperial powers. And the United States was a new, very weak nation. And the oceans were avenues for potential invasion. That is why what Thomas Jefferson began to do, and Monroe and other presidents would continue, was to build a network of coastal forts to protect American shores from foreign navies. Because America was pretty defenseless on the oceans. And it wasn't until the progressive era that when the so-called new Navy or modern steel Navy was constructed, that the United States really was in a position where it could sort of expand its horizons and defend itself in more depth on the oceans. But nevertheless, can we go back to Washington's precepts today? You're saying absolutely not. The world is so different. I understand that. As I suggest, as I said in my lecture here, but I say it in more detail in the book, it was obviously clear that the United States could not return to the precepts of Washington's farewell address as early as 1920. Because the World War and the beginnings of the 20th century outbreak of revolutions, not only in Cuba, but in Mexico, in China, in Russia, revolutions springing up all over the world. Commerce, the process of globalization had made the world far more integrated and the American economy more dependent. And so it was already clear by 1920 that Americans couldn't go back to their old civil religious beliefs about foreign policy. But the new beliefs that Wilson peddled had failed. And that's why they went into a long cusp. We're in the same situation today. Globalization ain't going away. And you better not hope it doesn't go away, or the entire economy is going to crash. And yet, somehow, the world, and the United States in particular, have to adjust to it. Can I just mention this is why we should not, I don't believe that we should exaggerate the phenomena of this year with regard to the Brexit vote and the Donald Trump vote and some of the recent elections in Europe. I don't know what's going to happen for the next 4 or 8 years, much less the next, the rest of the 21st century. We have others here who are probably far more able to speculate about that. I would simply say that, applying my historical, understanding, that that the Brexit and Trump phenomena are liable to be hiccups. They're bumps in the road, because the powers behind globalization are so massive, so awesome, have built up such momentum that you can't. There's absolutely no way to imagine how governments, mere national sovereignties, could reverse the process and rewind globalization, undoing presumably much of the social harm that the losers in the process of globalization have suffered. So chances are that let's put it this way, at best this is going to be a mid-course correction. And I think it's interesting that the British and the Americans, the most committed to liberalism of the classical sense, Toryism, liberalism, are the ones who are leading the charge, just as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan kind of led the brief renaissance in the late 70s and 80s. So maybe Trump will preside over a mid-course correction, not unlike the mid-course correction in the Cold War that Richard Nixon presided over. But he's not going to undo globalization, and I have a feeling that we're going to learn in the next 4 years that in fact he's not going to even try to reverse the process of globalization.
We're running a little late. We'll take one more question. We'll give it to David Rosenberg.
First, a quibble. You used the word chiliastic, which your colleague Adam Garfinkel has also used. The word is chiliastic from a Greek.
If you know Greek, I don't know Greek.
From a Greek word meaning 1,000, so it's a synonym for millennial, with all the religious overtones. A very interesting talk. My question is, what impact do you think the tragic assassination of Lincoln at the end of the Civil War had in terms of changing the thrust of the American civil religion? Because it seems to me that what happened was the myth of the lost cause became a means by which the white South and the white North reconciled at the expense of the freedmen, of the black people, and the suppression of Reconstruction in the United States. And then that merged with the European scientific racism, which became a part of the American ethos also. Just speculative, but I'm curious.
I think that speculation is more than speculation. I think it's quite plausible. Obviously, it's a counterfactual. We don't know what would happen if Lincoln had lived. But as I like to say, all good history is really counterfactual. Because you try to explain phenomena in the past, and you come up with with the various reasons why certain things happened at a certain time. These are all plausible reasons. You try to build a persuasive argument. But behind your argument is the unspoken implication that if this cause had been different, or that cause had been removed, if this piece of the jigsaw puzzle were taken away, everything would have been different. And so we don't know. But I think you're certainly onto something there, and I think that you're mentioning the scientific racism and the reconciliation of American whites, North and South, is very pertinent to my story, because when did that happen? The Great Reconciliation happened in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. And the Spanish-American War was kind of a symbol of this. There's a famous, I think it's a photograph that you encounter in textbooks that was made at this time of a man dressed in a Union general's uniform and a man dressed in a Confederate general's uniform, arm in arm, with some symbol of Cuba. Cuba Libre somewhere is in the picture. They're coming together again, fighting together as Americans against this foreign evil. And no one was more gung-ho. I talked about the liberal, progressive Protestant clergy. No one was more gung-ho to take over colonies and protectorates like Cuba, and to send in missionaries and export American institutions and values more than the Southern Methodist Church. Dozens or scores perhaps of Southern Methodist missionaries went off to Cuba right after the Spanish-American War with the idea that they were going to purge this culture, which incidentally is a couple of hundred years older than the United States itself, of its Catholicism and its backwardness and its ignorance and its superstition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And most of them were utter failures. But at any rate, there is a connection. All these nets and webs come together.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank Walter McDougall. I get the two confused every time I listen to a lecture by McDougall. It was a really profound meditation on the whole course of U.S. foreign policy, looking at it through a unique lens that Walter calls American civil religion. So this was a talk unique to McDougall. I just want to let you know that next year we are moving our geopolitics with Granary into the evenings here at the National Liberty Museum, beginning on January 24th with remarks by our good friend Robert Kaplan on his forthcoming book on how geography shapes the role of America in the world. On February 23rd, we launch our Princeton series with Robert Litvak of the Wilson Center talking about the threat from North Korea. And on March 8th, we launch our mainline briefings, which will also now be in the evenings rather than breakfasts. And that will feature our own Clint Watts talking about Russia and the spread of fake news. We still have one more program left this month with Eric Traeger on his new book on the rise and fall of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt on the main line. So thank you for joining us tonight. Have a happy holiday, a happy new year, and hope to see you soon.